that moment, an alert policeman scanning windows could have altered the course of history. For Lee Oswald was in position now, clearly visible to those below. A youth named Arnold Rowland, who knew guns, had been watching from below with his wife since 12:14 p.m. He saw Oswald silhouetted in the window, holding what appeared to be a high-powered rifle mounted with a telescopic sight. One of Oswald's hands was on the stock, the other was on the barrel. A police officer stood 12 feet from the Rowlands, but it never occurred to Arnold to speak to him. Assuming that Oswald must be protecting the president, he said to his wife, "Do you want to see a Secret Service agent?" "Where?" she asked. "In that building there," he said. Hello, welcome back to my channel, and if you are new with us, then I'd like to welcome you, and I'd also like to earn your subscription today. We are in part 3 of William Manchester's book, The Death of a President, and today's episode, and probably the one that will be tomorrow, will be about the day JFK died. This was a researched book that was done at the request of Jackie Kennedy. He spent 2.5, I believe, almost 3 years doing careful research, 1,000 different interviews, 41 volumes of his notes, and then he published a book called The Death of a President. I actually happened across it. You guys know, who are regulars, I have a lot of antique stores here just down the road from my house, and yesterday I went to a bookstore part of one of those, and they had the full copy of this book, which I had not ever noticed in print before. But this was a serialized version where they took chapters. And so the first Look magazine that we looked at, which was the last 2 episodes, was from the week before this. I believe it was January 31st, 1967. And then this one will have, I'm assuming, chapters 5 through 8. So we've gone through 4 chapters so far. It has been fascinating. I have enjoyed all of the details. I'm going to find our topic here. Let's see, page 40. But we have heard details about who made a lot of the decisions regarding which cities they would go to in Texas, the political machinations that were happening between various party people in the Democratic Party, why they chose the building where Kennedy was going to speak, which then decided the motorcade route so that they could get there. So today we are in The Death of a President by William Manchester, part 2. And I'm guessing that if the chapters are the same length, then we will get through 2 or perhaps 3 of them. This says Parkland Hospital, case number 24740. It says the hours of chaos, fear, and apprehension following John F. Kennedy's assassination. So let's go ahead and get started. I will remind you, because I am releasing so many videos this week, I will occasionally be taking a drink to keep my throat able to read without scratchiness. So please forgive my drinks and my occasional sniffles. Normally I edit those things out, but this week we are just enjoying kind of unedited versions together, so that we can get through a large quantity of reading together. So I hope you'll forgive that. Marina Oswald awoke at 6:30 on November 22nd, 1963 in Irving, Texas. She nursed the baby while her husband stood at the foot of the bed, dressing in a work shirt and gray trousers. For the last time, Lee Harvey Oswald said he really wanted her to buy things, clothes for herself, shoes for little Junie. She ignored him. Silently, she went back to sleep. Before departing for his job in nearby Dallas, he slipped off his wedding ring and left it in a little china cup. This was the day the chronic failure was going to demonstrate that he could succeed at something, that he was a man and did not deserve contempt. In the bedroom, he left $187 in bills. He kept $15.10. That wouldn't take him very far, but he knew he wasn't going far. He walked half a block eastward on 5th Street, carrying the rifle and telescopic sight in the brown paper wrapping he had brought from the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas the previous afternoon. Wesley Frazier joined Oswald outside his house. So Wesley Frazier lived near to Ruth Payne, and that's whose house he walked to. As he slid behind the wheel, he noticed the bundle on the back seat. "What's in the package, Lee?" he inquired. "Curtain rods," Oswald replied curtly. It was 7:25. 5 minutes later in Fort Worth, the chief executive's leisurely valet entered the Hotel Texas's Suite 850 and tapped on the door of the master bedroom. "Mr. President," George Thomas called gently. He heard a stirring of covers and crossed the threshold. "It's raining out," he murmured. "That's too bad," John Kennedy said groggily. Unlike Dwight Eisenhower, who had ignored newspapers, Kennedy scanned the leading dailies every morning soon after waking up. He was naturally alert to the reactions to the tour's first day. He found them, and he found that the feud between conservative Governor John B. Connally, Jr. and liberal Senator Ralph Yarborough had become the biggest political story in the nation. Texas papers were giving it prominence, and Dallas News led the pack with the 2 abrasive stories on the front page. "Storm of political controversy swirls around Kennedy on visit," and "Yarborough snubs LBJ." A third, inside, was headed, "President's Visit Seen, Widening State Democratic Split." Kennedy angrily thrust the paper aside, missing for the moment the inflammatory ad on the next page, ominously bordered in black, like an announcement of mourning. Under the sardonic heading, "Welcome Mr. Kennedy to Dallas," an organization styling itself as the American Fact-Finding Commission, a local coordinator of the John Birch Society, and Nelson Bunker Hunt, the son of H.L. Hunt, it later developed, were the committee's most prominent members, asked the president 12 rhetorical questions. The ad accused him of responsibility for the imprisonment, starvation, and persecution of, quote, "thousands of Cubans," and declared that it was he who was selling food to communist soldiers who were killing Americans in Vietnam. It hinted strongly that he had reached a secret agreement with the U.S. Communist Party. The stories Kennedy had read convinced him that the political bloodletting had become serious. Seizing the phone, he told his aide, Ken O'Donnell, that he wanted Senator Yarborough to ride in the vice presidential car today, and no excuse would be accepted. O'Donnell and his fellow aide, Larry O'Brien, must spell out the alternatives for Yarborough. Either he rode with Lyndon today, or he walked. Stepping into the hotel corridor, the president was still frowning. He spotted Clint Hill and Muggsy O'Leary at the Secret Service post and stepped over to them. "Mary Gallagher wasn't here last night to help Jackie," he said tartly, referring to Mrs. Kennedy's private secretary. "Mary hasn't any business in motorcades. She's supposed to reach hotels before we do, and so far she's batting 0. Get her on the ball." His flash of temper was over. He saw an elderly woman in a wheelchair, a resident of the hotel, and he paused to speak gently to her. In the hotel lobby, his entourage swelled. He crossed 8th Street and waded happily into the crowd, disregarding the drizzle, which had now become a fine mist. Secret Service agent Bill Greer had brought a raincoat for him and held it aloft, but Kennedy shook his head. Laughing exultantly, he mounted the flatbed truck. Not everyone there felt so enthusiastic. Hugh Sidey of Time magazine was struck by the difference between the president's mood and the vice president's. Sidey wished Lyndon Johnson a good morning. Johnson's answering greeting, he noted, was perfunctory. Organizing herself at her dressing table and listening to her husband's voice booming over the PA system below, Jackie Kennedy was pleased that it was raining. She hoped that the top would be on that car. She was concerned about her hair becoming disheveled. She didn't want her husband to be ashamed of her. She knew she looked tired. She carefully inspected her face. To Mary, she moaned, "Oh, gosh. One day's campaigning can age a person 30 years. The rain lifted as Wesley Frazier entered the outskirts of Greater Dallas, and before parking 2 blocks north of the book depository, he switched off his windshield wiper. The time and temperature sign overhead revealed that he had arrived in good time, and so he let his engine idle for several minutes on the theory that he was charging the battery. Then Oswald impatiently got out, carrying his package. Frazier's attention was diverted, and he followed shortly. By the time he reached the building, Oswald had climbed the loading platform and vanished inside. Oswald's movements in the next few minutes are a matter of conjecture based solely on circumstantial evidence. Superintendent Roy Truly later recalled meeting him by a book bin, saying, "Good morning, Lee," and receiving the customary reply, "Good morning, sir." But Truly was vague, and he had no recollection of the package. It is quite possible that he was thinking of another morning, that Lee had already ascended to the 6th floor using one of the 2 freight elevators or the enclosed stairway in the northwest corner of the book depository to conceal his weapon near the site he had selected. There, as in so many ways, blind chance had played into his hands. The old flooring had become oily. Truly, observing that books stored there frequently became stained, had ordered it replaced with battleship gray plywood. Half the floor was to be redone at a time. In preparation for the work, the rear or northern area had been largely cleared of cartons, while the southern side, which would face the passing motorcade, was a crowded jungle of cartons and wheeled book trucks. Concealment was easy, and it was there, sometime during the morning, that Oswald built his sniper's perch of boxes in the southeast corner, from which the president would be seen approaching dead ahead and then departing to the right front. So because of where the window is, he could see the president's motorcade coming directly at him, and then there was a sharp turn, and the president would turn and go away and down from that window. One pile of boxes hid him from anyone looking out the windows of the Daltex building on the opposite side of Houston Street. So here. Others would serve as props when he aimed. Still others would be used to provide a backstop against which ejected shells would bounce as he worked the bolt for each fresh shot. So it was a bolt action rifle, meaning you have to grab, pull, and the carton of the bullet, or am I saying that right? The carton, the ejected shell would go out and the new bullet would load. And so each time that Mannlicher Carcano rifle had to be manually adjusted with that bolt action. Across Houston Street, Abraham Zapruder strode into the office of his garment building on the 4th floor of the Daltex building. "Where's your camera?" his secretary demanded severely. "At home," he said timidly. They were good friends and often played this private game, pretending that she henpecked her boss. "Mr. Z, you march right back there. How many times will you have a crack at color movies of the president?" Zapruder fingered his bow tie and protested weakly, "I'm too short. Probably I wouldn't even get close." "The crowd'll be light downstairs," she said, and when he hesitated, she added firmly, "Hurry up! You can make it in 20 minutes. He turned back to the elevator on his short legs. It was 9:23 a.m. Chapter 2. So this would be our chapter 5, but it's chapter 2 in this printing. At the breakfast in Fort Worth a few minutes later, the hosts had boots for Jacqueline Kennedy and a 5-gallon hat for the president. To Ken and Larry, who were watching the ceremonies on television, this was a moment of high mirth. They knew how the president had always avoided queer costumes and wondered how he would get out of this one. He sidestepped the problem deftly by announcing that he would put the hat on in Washington Monday, but his wife was hoping he would wear it sooner. As he began his address, she thought ahead to tomorrow on the LBJ ranch. Lady Bird had asked her to ask the president if there was anything special he would like there. "I'd like to ride," he had replied. She remembered now what a good rider he was and how during the summer of their engagement he had galloped bareback through the fields of Newport on a work horse. That Stetson would be decidedly becoming when he mounted an LBJ horse, she reflected. She thought he looked silly in ordinary hats, but anything picturesque, his naval officer's cap, the silk hat at his inaugural, was splendid on him. Although she had not seen the ranch, she vividly recalled her husband's account of his visit there 8 days after his election to the presidency. It had been a singular one, and in one respect, a distressing one. The afternoon they arrived, the vice president proposed a dawn hunt the next day. To Kennedy, shooting tame game was not sport, and he had tried to bow out gracefully. To him, all killing was senseless. But how do you explain such scruples to a gracious host? You don't. He would never understand. He might even think he's squeamish, and that was the crux of Kennedy's problem. As a national leader, he was obliged to resolve any doubts about his mettle. Besides, Lyndon had been dogged. He was determined to be cordial, and this was the finest treat his ranch could offer. Had he dreamed that his hunting invitation might give offense, he never would have mentioned it. To Johnson, Kennedy's reluctance seemed only a polite gesture, like demurring at a second helping. So at 6 a.m. on November 17, 1960, they had turned out yawning by the ranch's fieldstone facade. Johnson wore a stained, shapeless cowboy hat and a weather-beaten leather jacket. Kennedy donned a checkered sport coat and slacks. A fellow guest, peering at him sleepily, thought he looked like a football fan. The mechanics were relatively simple. To him, hitting a bullseye wasn't much of an accomplishment. Only in hunting animals. That isn't all. There is one other matter, one fraction of a moment that to this hunter was anguish. It is the confrontation when the killer faces his prey. In that instant, in the season before his inaugural, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had squinted down the barrel of a high-powered rifle and looked into the face of the life he was about to take. He had committed himself. He couldn't flinch. He fired and quickly turned back to the car. Yet he couldn't rid himself of the recollection. The memory of the creature's death had been haunting. And afterward, he had relived it with his wife, trying to heal the inner scar. Nor had that been the end of it. Early in the new administration, Lyndon had had the trophy mounted, not just the antlers, but the face too. And one morning after a legislative leadership breakfast, he crossed the south lawn of the White House, lugging it under his arm. Why not display it on the wall of the presidential office, he suggested. Kennedy, feigning interest, was inwardly appalled. After the vice president had departed, he ordered the head put away and forgotten. It wasn't forgotten, though. Lyndon telephoned a jovial inquiry from his suite in the Executive Office Building, just across the West Executive Avenue from the White House. Where was that deer? When was it going up? Later, he mentioned it again and then again. Eventually, the trophy, like any other gift that has been repeatedly declined, became an issue between them. And once more, Kennedy acceded. The specimen was hung, not in the Oval Office, but in the nearby fish room. The president had granted a favor. How great a favor only the First Lady knew, and his vice president had been genuinely pleased. Give and take. Win a few, lose a few. That was the strategy of public office. In one version of his pet joke, the last line of which could be adapted to the occasion, he used to tell his friends that the three most overrated things in the world are the state of Texas, the FBI, and mounted deer heads. Well, I'll try not to take offense about the state of Texas. You know how we Texans are. We're super proud of our state. The First Lady felt buoyant, and back in the suite, she decided to reassert her determination to make every political trip between now and next November. The president was on the phone, summoning O'Donnell. Hanging up, he told her they wouldn't have to leave until 10:40. "Do you mean we have a whole hour to just sit around?" she asked incredulously. "Oh, Jack, campaigning is so easy when you're president. Listen, I can go anywhere with you this year." As Ken came into the drawing room, Kennedy said, "How about California in the next 2 weeks?" "Fine, I'll be there," she promised, and was rewarded with one of O'Donnell's rare smiles. Today was the 95th birthday of John Nance Garner. At 10:14 a.m., while her husband called Uvalde, Texas, to wish the former vice president a pleasant afternoon, she strolled through their rooms. She returned with an astounding discovery. In the fatigue of last night and in the haste of this morning, the Kennedys had not noticed that they were surrounded by a priceless art exhibition. On the walls and tables were a Monet, a Picasso, a Van Gogh, a Prendergast, and 12 other celebrated oil paintings, watercolors, and bronzes. A catalog, which had also been overlooked, disclosed that the exhibit was in their honor. "Isn't this sweet, Jack?" she said as he hung up on Uvalde. "They've just stripped their whole museum of all their treasures to brighten this dingy hotel suite." He knew it had been for her. She was the patroness of the family. Taking the catalog, he said, "Let's see who did it." There were several names at the end. The first was Mrs. J. Lee Johnson III. "Why don't we call her?" he suggested. "She must be in the phone book." Thus, Ruth Carter Johnson, the wife of a Fort Worth newspaper executive, became the surprised recipient of John Kennedy's last telephone call. O'Donnell had a far less agreeable surprise for the president. While Kennedy was speaking in the ballroom, Mac Kilduff, the acting press secretary, had leafed through the Dallas News, had found that ugly advertisement, and brought it directly to O'Donnell's rooms. Now Kennedy saw it for the first time. He read each word, his face grim, and handed it to Jackie. Her vivacity disappeared. She felt sick. The president shook his head. Slowly he said to her, "Oh, you know we are heading into nut country today." The president prowled the floor. Abruptly he paused in front of his wife. "You know, last night would have been a hell of a night to assassinate a president," he murmured. He said it casually, and she took it lightly. It was his way of shaking off the ad. He had what she called a Walter Mitty streak. Like a little boy, he would watch a passing jet from the fantail of the Honey Fitz, wondering aloud if he could fly it, picturing himself wrestling with the controls. "I mean it," he said now, building the daydream. "There was the rain and the night, and we were all getting jostled. Suppose a man had a pistol in a briefcase." He gestured vividly, pointing his rigid index finger at the wall and jerking his thumb twice to show the action of the hammer. Then he could have dropped the gun and the briefcase. In pantomime, he dropped them and whirled in a tense crouch and melted away in the crowd. Lyndon Johnson came in. I mean, that's really ominous, isn't it, that he did this? I've never heard this account. Lyndon Johnson came in immediately after this 007 caper. His sister and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Burge Alexander, were with him. They wanted to shake hands with a president. Lyndon introduced them, and then, respectful as always, quietly withdrew, motioning them to accompany him. But his visit had reminded Kennedy of the party's fratricide. The president ordered Ken to call Larry immediately and tell him Yarborough must ride with the vice president, even if the senator had to be picked up and thrown into the back seat. At the end of the call, he snatched the phone from O'Donnell and said deliberately to O'Brien, stressing each word, "Get him in the car." Ken left to join Larry, and Jacqueline Kennedy examined the still uncertain sky. She hoped it would darken. It would be ridiculous to spend all that time getting ready and then ruin everything in a 45-minute ride in an open car. "Oh, I want the bubble top," she said wistfully. The issue was being resolved against her at that very moment. The president, anticipating the result, was changing to a lightweight suit in his bedroom. He had a hunch that they were heading into more hot weather. Down the hall, O'Donnell was on the phone with Roy Kellerman, the ranking Secret Service agent. On another line, Kellerman was holding Agents Forrest Sorrells and Winston Lawson, who were standing by in Dallas. They were at Love Field with the top. Should it go up? Ken asked how things looked over there, and Roy relayed the question. The Weather Bureau had hedged, and the Dallas News had predicted rain, but Sorrells felt positive the wind would blow the storm eastward. If the weather is clear and it's not raining, have that bubble top off, O'Donnell said. Then they all crossed their fingers. But not for long. Awaiting Yarbrough in front of the hotel, O'Donnell and O'Brien anxiously scrutinized the clouds, and as they watched, their spirits lifted. In the distance, a thin ribbon of lemon-colored light appeared. O'Donnell took a deep breath. There would be no bubble top. O'Brien winked at him and said, "Kennedy weather." The motorcade to Carswell Air Force Base was ready. The press buses had filled early because none of the reporters wanted to miss Ralph Yarbrough's exit. Yarbrough trudged out, deep in thought. O'Brien darted to his side. "We wish you'd reconsider, Senator," he began. "The president will be very pleased if you ride with the vice president." Yarbrough was about to shake his head. O'Brien scanned the press buses, and he said swiftly, "They're watching us, you know. This is their big story." The senator planted his legs and intoned, "I'll be proud to talk to them about proof of the president's popularity, Larry." He glanced up. It wasn't taking. Larry was just standing there stolidly. "Look," Yarbrough said, "I'll issue a statement." Impassively, Larry replied, "You can issue a statement of 10,000 words, but nothing will be as effective as you getting in that car." Out of the corner of his eye, he observed the Johnsons emerging from the hotel. It was 10:40. They were ready to go. Unexpectedly, Yarbrough then capitulated. "Well, if it means that much," he began resignedly. "It does," said O'Brien, cutting him off. Turning to Johnson, he muttered, "The senator is riding with you and Mrs. Johnson." In an undertone, the vice president replied, "Fine." An incident of the opera buffet followed. O'Brien escorted them to the car. Yarbrough was behind the driver, Lady Bird in the middle, Lyndon on the right. Just as Larry was about to close the senator's door, a National Committee advance man appeared on the other side with Nellie Connolly. The 5-passenger Lincoln assigned to the president for the drive to the airfield would accommodate only the Kennedys, the governor, and Kellerman and Greer of the Secret Service. The governor's lady had to go elsewhere. To the advance man, this seemed the logical place, and he started to put her in the back beside Johnson, but there was room for just 3 people in the rear. As the vice president and Mrs. Johnson slid over to make room for the new arrival, Yarbrough on the far side of Nellie was being inexorably squeezed out. Recognizing a blessing in disguise, he began edging off the seat and back toward the sidewalk. Larry thought bitterly, "There goes the old ball game." In desperation, he resorted to physical force. Blocking the senator's broad shoulders with his own stocky hips, he flapped his hands frantically at the advance man who got the message. Without explanation, there really was nothing he could have said. He plucked Nellie out and escorted her to the front seat. Puzzled, the governor's wife found herself riding between the police driver and Agent Rufus Youngblood. Interesting. So she probably was confused, but there was a lot of wrangling happening there in that moment. At Love Field in Dallas, security was tight. Armed policemen stood on every rooftop of the airport's eastern concourse, and an elderly, hawk-faced agent was chasing a photographer back behind the barrier. But to pilot Colonel Jim Swindoll, it looked like another Viva throng. Viewed from his cockpit, the people seemed to be typical Texans, ready to give Kennedy his most boisterous reception since San Antonio. It wasn't that simple. In San Antonio, the president had been greeted by an entire city. Here, the greeters were members of the local underground. Liberals were making a valiant showing here and all along the route. A row of school truants held an American flag and a brave "We Love Jack." And a little Negro boy waved a square of cardboard reading, "Hooray for JFK." In numbers and noise, the liberals were anxious to outshout Kennedy's audiences in Houston and Fort Worth. The very fact that they were swamped in Dallas elections, estranged from the majority and scorned by the city's most powerful men, had kindled a special fire in them. Yet this crowd wasn't the voice of Dallas. Liberal Texas Congressman Henry Gonzalez noticed how people would start to wave, then jerk their hands back and glance nervously over their shoulders. The 12-man official reception committee reflected the peculiarities of Dallas. Not a single representative of organized labor was present, which for a Democratic president was extraordinary. The local unions had been eager to participate in the ceremonies here and at the luncheon, but after a series of exasperating encounters with the Republicans and right-wing Democrats who dominated the host committee, they had given up. The delegation waiting to greet the president consisted of 9 Republicans, 2 Dixiecrats, and a lone liberal, Barefoot Sanders. Appropriately, the first man to bound through their reception line was not the president, but Connally. The governor was violating protocol, but this, after all, was his hand-picked team, just as he was their man. Kennedy couldn't carry Dallas. The Democratic governor, however, was a local hero. Kennedy stepped out on the top step, narrowing his eyes as he sized up the crowd in one sweeping glance. Mrs. Kennedy appeared beside him, and the underground roared its approval. At the bottom, the Johnsons had been waiting patiently for 5 minutes. For the fourth time in less than 24 hours, they were welcoming the Kennedys to a new city in their best "nice of you to come" manner, and both couples felt slightly silly. Moreover, there would be 2 more such landings today, at Bergstrom Air Force Base near Austin and at the ranch, which of course neither of those would actually happen. Lyndon looked up at Jackie, shrugging comically at the absurdity of it all, and she laughed. Once the reception line broke up, the vice president's Dallas work was done. His next scheduled performance wouldn't come until 3:15 when they reached Bergstrom. The masked cheerers on the other side of the chain fence were for the president. The vice president, after a token appearance, led Lady Bird to the gray 4-door convertible. He was so depressed by the continuing feud in the local party that he ordered the car's commercial radio turned on full blast to drown out the noise of the crowd. That's petty, isn't it? To not even want to hear them cheering for the president. Aboard Air Force One, George Thomas was sorting out clothes. On the inboard bunk, he laid out a complete change for the next stop, Austin. Shirt, socks, shoes, and a lightweight blue suit. Then, reflecting that the president would be tired when he returned to the plane, he thought it would be nice to leave a reminder that tonight at the ranch, there would be a respite from speeches and parades. Beside the shirt, he put a pair of khaki pants, a sweater, and a sports shirt. At the fence, Roy Kellerman remained inches behind the president, studying faces and cameras, like a good Secret Service agent should. A local reporter told a Washington correspondent, "The Dallas police have learned their lesson. After Kennedy leaves here, they won't let anybody within 10 feet of him." The chief executive continued down the line. Ronnie Duggar of the Texas Observer wrote in his notebook, "Kennedy is showing he is not afraid." As the moment for the departure of the motorcade approached, there was an undignified scramble for seats, and Dr. George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, wound up in the lowly VIP bus. The doctor wasn't concerned about status, but he told Evelyn Lincoln, the president's secretary, "I don't see why they can't put me in that lead car. I wouldn't mind sitting on an agent's lap." Of course, there was only an outside chance that he would be needed, but the chance was Dr. Berkeley's sole reason for being there. O'Brien had assumed that the Yarborough problem was solved. Suddenly, he realized that the senator had mentioned nothing about riding with the vice president here. Simultaneously, O'Brien saw Kennedy staring at him and cutting his eye meaningfully toward Yarborough, like this. I do this all the time with my children. If we have people over or there's something going on or we're in church, like trying to get people to look, like, notice that right there. Larry he was cutting his eye meaningfully toward Yarborough, who appeared to be looking for another car. Larry grabbed the senator's arm, shoved him onto the seat beside Lady Bird, and slammed the door. The motorcade was beginning to move. So they did get Yarborough into that spot next to Lady Bird. So he's not sitting next to LBJ. Lady Bird is kind of a soft person between the two, but they got Senator Yarborough there in the same seat with the vice president. Chapter 3 for today, or chapter 7 for us. All morning, the floor laying crew had been working on the cleared section of the Texas School Book Depository's 6th floor. Now it was time for a midday break, sandwiches, and afterward the spectacle at the front door. Feelings about the motorcade were mixed. There was little sympathy among the employees at the book depository for the president's uncompromising stand in behalf of equal rights for Negroes. Roy Truly, who didn't believe the races were meant to mix, later doubted that, quote, half my boys would have gone out to see the parade if it hadn't been lunchtime, end quote. He explained, except for my N-word, the boys are conservative, like me, like most Texans. Still, a parade was a parade. 15 minutes before noon, the men used both of the building's antiquated elevators to race to the street level. As they passed the 5th floor, Charles Givens saw Lee Oswald standing by the gate, watching them go. Their departure left the top stories unoccupied. In effect, the upper part of the warehouse had now met the Secret Service's definition of the classic sniper's perch. It was a deserted building. Makes you wonder why there weren't Secret Service agents who had scoped that out and made sure that there was arrangements for protection of the president. Perhaps they don't do that, but for an open car ride, it would seem that every building ought to be assessed and secured in some way. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe that's over-assessment on my part of what should happen, but if you're going to protect the president, it seems like that would be necessary. Yet, no gunman can be certain that he will not be interrupted by a casual intruder whose memory will later place the killer at the scene. It happened to Oswald. Givens discovered that he had left his cigarettes in his jacket pocket. He came back and encountered Oswald on the 6th floor. So we've just been told that they passed the 5th floor and Givens saw him standing by the gate of the elevator opening. This is a really large, I actually just saw it. I think I have a picture of it, so I'll put it up here. I went to the Texas School Book Depository last month. My husband took me for my birthday. And it's a very, very large, wide, square elevator that would have held tons of weight for taking books up and down the lift. So that we're being told that they saw him at the gate of that 5th floor elevator, but now he's encountering him on the 6th floor. Boy, aren't you coming downstairs? He asked, surprised. It's near lunchtime. No, sir, replied Oswald, respectful as always. Possibly to allay suspicion, more likely to prepare the way for his escape, he said, when you get downstairs, close the gate to the elevator. He meant the west elevator, which could be summoned from above only when the gate was down. Okay, said Givens, turning away. Oh, so if the gate was down, you couldn't call it to go up. You'd have to reset it so that then it could go back up. Now Oswald was alone with over half an hour for his final preparations. Downstairs, Givens discovered that he couldn't close the west elevator's gate. The elevator wasn't there. It was stuck upstairs somewhere. Givens strolled away thinking no more about it. It was his recollection that the time was 11:55 a.m. 20 minutes later, Roy Truly and his boys were in front of the depository, listening for the growl of approaching motorcycles. At that moment, an alert policeman scanning windows could have altered the course of history. For Lee Oswald was in position now, clearly visible to those below. A youth named Arnold Rowland, who knew guns, had been watching from below with his wife since 12:14 p.m. He saw Oswald silhouetted in the window, holding what appeared to be a high-powered rifle mounted with a telescopic sight. One of Oswald's hands was on the stock, the other was on the barrel. A police officer stood 12 feet from the Rowlands, but it never occurred to Arnold to speak to him. Assuming that Oswald must be protecting the president, he said to his wife, "Do you want to see a Secret Service agent?" "Where?" she asked. "In that building there," he said. On the west side of Houston Street, Robert Edwards and Ronald Fisher had been waiting since 12:20. Suddenly, Edwards pointed and said, "Look at that guy." Fisher followed his finger. The weapon was below their line of sight. What had attracted Edwards' attention was Oswald's stance. Fisher agreed that it was peculiar. The man they saw was transfixed, staring to his right, away from Maine. To Fisher, it seemed that he never moved. He was just gazing like a statue. The closest known eyewitnesses, Howard Brennan, a frail pipe fitter, had headed for the plaza at 12:18 p.m. The time and temperature sign on the depository roof pinpointed the moment, and settled down on a 3.5-foot white cement wall on the edge of the plaza, directly across from the warehouse entrance. Brennan was 40 yards beneath Oswald. Waiting in the sun, he dried his forehead on the sleeve of his khaki work shirt and then peered up, hoping the sign would tell him the temperature. But that part of it was obscure from here. His eyes dropped to the warehouse's 6th floor, to the pinched face of Lee Oswald, now in profile. He too wondered why the young man was standing stock still. There was a sound of distant shouting from Main Street. Brennan, Rowland, Edwards, and Fisher forgot the strange figure in the open window and pivoted. Edwards said excitedly, "Here it comes." At 12:24, Jim Hosty, an FBI agent who was in charge of the Bureau's current investigation of Oswald, watched Kennedy from the curb and then stepped into the Alamo Grill for lunch. He had seen the president. His day, he felt, was made. When the motorcade reached Main and Market Street at 12:28, it occurred to Yarborough that anyone could drop a pot of flowers on Kennedy from an upper story. Beyond them, the green of Dealey Plaza was visible. My, that open sky looks good, the senator thought. At Houston and Elm, Agent Sorrells radioed the trademark that they would reach there in 5 minutes. Then Agent Lawson automatically scanned the overpass. There were railway workers on top, a security breach. Through the windshield, he motioned urgently to a policeman there in a yellow rain slicker, indicating that he wanted the area cleared. The officer was unresponsive. He didn't understand. Agent Greer, recovering from the difficult turn, started to relax. The strain was over. Then he too noticed the workman. Puzzled, he studied the unfamiliar street to see whether he could veer at the last minute if necessary and take the president beneath a deserted part of the span. The Lincoln was now passing a pine oak that momentarily screened John Kennedy from the muzzle in the 6th floor corner window. Abe Zapruder, hunched over his Zoom-R lens, was photographing the presidential car, SS-100X in Secret Service code, as it approached him. Nellie pointed to the underpass and said to Jackie, "We're almost through. It's just beyond that." Jackie thought how pleasant the cool tunnel would be. Everything seemed very quiet here. She turned to wave to the left. In the front seat of the follow-up car, Agent Emery Roberts radioed the MART, half back to base, 5 minutes to destination. He then wrote in his shift report, 12:35 p.m., President Kennedy arrived at Trade Mart. That's interesting that they would go ahead and write that in advance. Mac Kilduff, misreading the sign on the front of the warehouse, said to Washington correspondent Merriman Smith, "What the hell is a book repository?" Further back in the motorcade, Evelyn Lincoln was saying, "Just think, we've come through all of Dallas and there hasn't been a single demonstration." The Lincoln moved ahead at 11.2 miles an hour. It passed the tree. Zapruder, slowly swinging his camera to the right, found himself photographing the back of a freeway sign. Momentarily, the entire car was obscured, but it was no longer hidden from the 6th floor corner window. It had passed the last branch. Spectator Charles Brenn's 5-year-old boy timidly raised his hand. The president smiled warmly. He raised his hand to wave back. There was a sudden, sharp, shattering sound. Most of the hunters in the motorcade identified the sound immediately as rifle fire, but the White House detail was confused. The agents were unaccustomed to the bizarre effects created when small arms fire echoes among unfamiliar structures, such as the buildings around Dealey Plaza. Secret Service agents Kellerman, Lawson, Greer, Reddy, and Hill all thought the sound they heard had been caused by an exploding firecracker. It was only when he saw the president lurch forward and grab his neck that Clint Hill, who had extraordinary reflexes, leapt out of halfback, as the follow-up car was known in Secret Service code, and charged forward toward SS-100X. The reflexes of the agent nearest the president were crucial in those seconds after the first shot was fired. There are standard tests to measure this ability, and any jet pilot who fails such a test is grounded. However, presidential bodyguards were not required to take them. In addition, a man's reflexes slow down as he ages, and the pace at which he lives may slow them further. The Secret Service pace was furious. Men assigned to the White House detail averaged from 50 to 80 hours overtime every month. 50 to 80 hours of overtime. So that would be 2 hours to 20 hours per week of overtime. No, that's not right. Yeah, 12 hours to 20 hours of overtime every single week. That's a lot of hours. At 40, they said among themselves, a man on this detail is old. Yet, service tradition dictated that the posts closest to Kennedy should be reserved for senior men. Greer, the president's driver, was 54. Kellerman, who sat beside Greer, was 48. They were both in the lead car with Kennedy. They were in a position to take evasive action after the first shot, but for 5 terrible seconds, they were immobilized. In the vice presidential car, Yarborough thought he smelled gunpowder. "My God," he yelled, "they've shot the president." Agent Rufus Youngblood hurtled over the front seat toward Johnson. He was less positive than he seemed. He was thinking that this was going to be very embarrassing if he were wrong, but his voice was firm. "Get down," he snapped at Johnson. In the VIP bus, Dr. Berkeley was staring out absently at store windows. The president's physician had heard nothing. He was too far back in the motorcade. The president was wounded, but not fatally. A 6.5 millimeter bullet had entered the back of his neck, bruised his right lung, ripped his windpipe, and exited at his throat, nicking the knot of his tie. How did it bruise his lung? That seems impossible. Can somebody help me with that? That seems impossible. Nicking the knot of his tie. In the summer of 1966, a former Cornell graduate student published a dissertation that suggested that this first bullet followed a different trajectory. The implication was that a second assassin had aided Oswald. The issue was resolved by the x-rays and photographs which were taken from every conceivable angle during the autopsy on the president's body. Robert Kennedy has decided that this material is too unsightly to be shown to anyone, including qualified scholars, until 1971. He has turned it over to the National Archives with that restriction. Although this writer has not seen the materials, he interviewed 3 people with special qualifications who examined it before it was put under seal. None of them knew the other 2, but all 3 gave identical accounts of what they had seen in the photographs and x-rays. The x-rays showed no entry wound below the shoulder, as argued by the graduate student. Admittedly, x-rays of active projectiles passing through soft tissue are difficult to read. However, the photographs support them in this case and clearly reveal that the wound was in the neck. Finally, the recollection of all doctors present during the autopsy, including the president's personal physician, agree unanimously with this overwhelming evidence. Continuing its flight, the bullet had passed through Governor Connolly's back, chest, right wrist, and left thigh. Although the governor, suffering a delayed reaction, was not yet aware of it. Interesting. As the Lincoln emerged from behind the freeway sign, Abe Zapruder, the amateur movie photographer, saw the stifled look on the president's face and was stunned. Nellie Connolly twisted in her seat and looked sharply at Kennedy. His hands were at his throat, but he wasn't grimacing. He had slumped a little. Roy Kellerman thought he had heard the president call in his inimitable accent, "My God, I'm hit." Roy looked over his left shoulder. Greer was looking over his right shoulder. The car, wobbling from side to side, slowly veered out of line, and both saw that Kennedy was hit. At this instant, the impact of John Connolly's wound hit him. He pitched forward, saw that his lap was covered with blood, and toppled to the left toward his wife. Interestingly, I believe the doctors said that this movement that he did actually closed the wound that would have taken his life from bleeding out. So interestingly, his instinct to curl ended up closing the wound and temporarily keeping him from bleeding to a degree that would have, I think, taken his life. Suddenly, the governor felt doomed. He panicked. "No, no, 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 no," he shrieked. "They're going to kill us both." Jacqueline Kennedy heard him, and in a daze, she wondered, why is he screaming? Already, she had started to turn anxiously toward her husband. Greer turned back to the wheel. Kellerman, hesitant, glanced over his shoulder again. Neither had yet reacted to the crisis. So this is the 5 terrible seconds it was talking about, immobilization, where they're just looking and looking, but not taking reactive action to, like they said, use their extraordinary reflexes and take evasive action. Instead of that, they're just immobilized. Now it was too late. Spectator Howard Brennan, open-mouthed, saw Oswald take deliberate aim for his final shot. Crooking his arm, Oswald drew a fresh bead with his Italian rifle. His target, startlingly clear in the crosshairs of his telescopic sight, was 88 yards away. He squeezed the trigger again. The First Lady, in her last act as First Lady, leaned solicitously toward the president. His face was quizzical. She had seen that expression so often when he was puzzling over a difficult press conference question. Now, in a gesture of infinite grace, he raised his right hand as though to brush back his tousled chestnut hair, but the motion faltered. The hand fell limply. He had been reaching for the top of his head, but it wasn't there anymore. The interior of the presidential Lincoln was a place of horror. The last bullet had torn through John Kennedy's cerebellum, the lower part of his brain. Leaning toward her husband, Jacqueline saw a piece of his skull detach itself. At first, there was no blood, and then in the next instant, there was nothing but blood spattering her. The Connollys, Kellerman, Greer, the upholstery. Gobs of blood as thick as a man's hand soaked the floor of the back seat. The president's clothes were steeped in it. The roses were drenched. Motorcycle police officer Bobby Hargis was doused in the face by a red sheet. To Kellerman, it appeared that the air was full of moist sawdust. John Connolly screamed again and again in agony. In terror, Nellie began to scream too. They were saturated. Jacqueline rose on her stained knees, facing toward the sidewalk, and cried, "My God, what are they doing? My God, they've killed Jack. They've killed my husband, Jack, Jack." There was also a reaction in the front seat of SS-100X. "Move it out," Kellerman told Greer. Into his intercom microphone, he said, "Lawson, this is Kellerman. We are hit. Get us to a hospital." The back of the Lincoln was equipped with metal grips on the trunk for agents and a step on each side of the spare tire. Clint Hill had his fingers in the left grip and his toe on the left step, 1.6 seconds after the last shot. He had just begun to surge up when Greer rammed the accelerator to the floor. The Lincoln sprang forward, dislodging Clint's foot. He was dead weight and dragging. Mrs. Kennedy pivoted toward the rear and reached for him. Their hands touched, clenched, and locked. It is impossible to say who saved whom. Neither remembers, and the film taken by Abe Zapruder is inconclusive. Mrs. Kennedy, who was in deep shock, has no recollection of being on the trunk at all. She drew Clint up, and he, vaulting ahead, pushed her down until she tumbled back into the car, and he spread-eagled his body across the back of the Lincoln. He could hold on now, but that was small consolation. From the street, he had seen Kennedy's head wound. He knew it was mortal, knew the Secret Service had failed, and in anguish and frustration, he hammered the trunk with his free hand. As the presidential car raced toward the hospital, Governor Connolly lapsed into unconsciousness. He believed he was dying. So did his wife. Putting her mouth to his ear, Nellie whispered, "It's going to be all right. Be still." Yet she didn't believe it. She doubted that anything would ever be all right again. For a while, she thought he was already dead. Then one of his hands trembled slightly. Quietly, she put her own over it. Nellie heard a muted sobbing from the back seat. In a strangled voice, Jacqueline Kennedy was saying, "He's dead. They've killed him. Oh, Jack, I love you." There was a pause. Then she began again. Nellie and Clint could hear Mrs. Kennedy, but she could not hear herself. Reality came to her in dim flashes. She had heard Kellerman on the radio and had wondered why it had taken the car so long to leave. Next, in her red daze, she had become preoccupied with the president's head. Huddled on the ruined cushion, cradling his shoulders in her arms and his head in her gloves, she crouched over him. Trying to heal the unhealable seemed to be all that mattered. She couldn't bear the thought that others should see what she had seen. And that's the end of that chapter. We will continue this reading tomorrow. I have nothing else to say. This was a hard reading. I hope you're enjoying it, even though it's hard. As we remember this week, the 61st anniversary of the day that JFK died. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.